good evening, and welcome. Tonight, let us settle in and explore a question that is often lost in the grand narratives of history, a question that lies beneath the stories of great battles and monumental events. What did the soldiers of the Second World War truly eat? From the American K-rations to the German ersatz spreads, and from the cabbage soup of the Soviets to the simple rice balls of the Japanese, we will be gently peeling back the layers of history one meal at a time. Before we begin our journey, if you find value in these stories, please take a moment to show your support, and it is always a pleasure to hear from you. So feel free to leave a comment mentioning where in the world you are listening from and what time it is for you. It is a wonderful thing to see our community connect from across the globe. Now, you might dim your lights and perhaps find a source of soft, ambient sound to help you unwind. Let us comfortably transition into tonight's story together. Long before the first shots of the war were ever fired, before tanks moved across the European landscape or aircraft filled the skies, every military force contended with a universal and far from glamorous challenge: how to feed its vast number of soldiers. When we reflect on the Second World War, our thoughts often turn to famous battles, incredible acts of bravery, and the grainy black and white images from old newsreels. We seldom pause to consider the more fundamental questions. For instance, did a soldier landing on the beaches of Normandy have breakfast? And if he did, what could it possibly have been? It certainly wasn't pancakes. The task of feeding millions of men scattered across different continents was more than just a culinary challenge. It was a logistical nightmare, fraught with difficulty. These rations needed to be portable, resistant to spoilage, and affordable to produce. Preferably, they also wouldn't be a source of misery for the men who ate them. Flavor was a low priority, ranking far below concerns like whether the packaging would explode if dropped, or if the contents would attract pests. Each nation approached this problem with its own unique methods. The Americans applied scientific principles to create sustenance, resulting in small, optimistic packages known as K-rations. The Germans, in the early stages of the war, supplied their troops with substantial meals of meat and rye bread, though this was later replaced with provisions that felt more like a punishment. The British held onto their tradition of tea as if it were the very thing keeping the empire intact. And perhaps it was. The Soviets, following a time-honored tradition, boiled vast quantities of cabbage. The Japanese soldiers were expected to travel with minimal supplies and fight with great intensity, often sustained by little more than rice balls and their own resolve. Food was not merely fuel. It was a cornerstone of morale. A warm meal had the power to lift spirits, while a cold tin of greasy meat could just as easily crush them. Some soldiers grew to have a certain fondness for their rations, while others vowed to never touch another military cracker for the rest of their lives. Many found themselves dreaming not of victory or glory, but of simple things like butter, fresh bread, and anything that didn't come wrapped in brown paper. And so, while generals debated grand strategies in their war rooms, ordinary soldiers in foxholes were trading chocolate for cigarettes and hoping their companions wouldn't sleep through the call for mess. Tonight, we will not focus on the battles that were won or the borders that were redrawn. Instead, we will explore the world of Spam, crackers, and powdered eggs, delving into the quiet conflict between soldiers and the strange, often suspicious, contents of their ration tins. Because if one truth is universal in war, it is that everyone must eat, even when the food itself seems to fight back. Imagine you are a US soldier during World War II. You have marched for 10 miles, endured enemy fire, and have not seen modern plumbing in weeks. Your stomach growls with a sound that could almost be mistaken for distant artillery. Your meal for the day arrives: the K-ration. It was a compact, calorie-dense box, a small cardboard miracle seemingly designed by individuals who had never had to eat one themselves. The K-ration was divided into 3 separate boxes: one for breakfast, one for lunch, and one for dinner. Each was roughly the size of a small brick and, at times, felt just as dense. The contents of each box provided just enough sustenance to be considered nutritious, while also preparing you for the emotional rigors of combat through sheer culinary disappointment. Breakfast began with a canned mixture of ham and eggs, which tasted distinctly of neither. Its texture was something akin to a blend of processed meat and plaster. Accompanying this were rock-hard crackers, some instant coffee, powdered lemonade, a few sticks of gum, and 4 cigarettes, because nothing completed a balanced breakfast quite like tobacco. And to top it all off, a single sheet of toilet paper was included. Just one. You had to make it last. Lunch offered little improvement. It might contain a cheese spread that seemed to consist more of chemicals than actual cheese. There was another portion of biscuits capable of testing the strength of one's jaw, and a chocolate bar so dense it could have served as makeshift armor for a tank. If you didn't have a spoon, you learned to improvise using a knife, a stick, or simply your own frustration to get the food out of the can. Dinner was typically a meat and bean mixture that looked rather unappetizing in its tin. This was served with more crackers, more gum, and, if you were fortunate, a tiny fruit bar that tasted as if someone had merely whispered the word apple over a piece of wood. Despite their uninspiring taste, K-rations were marvels of nutritional science. They provided roughly 3,000 calories a day, packed with protein, fat, and sugar, with just enough flavor to prevent you from accidentally enjoying the meal. Soldiers often traded components among themselves, much like inmates in a prison yard. Cigarettes were bartered for chocolate, and cheese was exchanged for crackers. Anything to avoid another encounter with the canned ham. But every so often, a soldier would find a real Hershey bar. It was genuine chocolate, a true comfort from home. For the moment it took to eat that one piece, you were no longer in a muddy trench. You were back home. That feeling alone made tolerating the rest of the ration worthwhile. So while the K-ration was dry, oddly shaped, and had a taste that seemed to embody the hardship of war, it was ultimately the fuel that helped power a global conflict, one questionable meal at a time. If the K-ration was the Army's concept of a meal, then the D-ration was its idea of a survival tool disguised as a chocolate bar. It looked like a chocolate bar, was wrapped like a chocolate bar, and was given to soldiers as a chocolate bar. But the similarities ended there. This was not a sweet treat from Hershey's. The D-ration was specifically engineered in partnership with the U.S. Army to meet 3 criteria. First, it had to resist melting in high heat. Second, it needed an exceptionally long shelf life. And third, it was designed to taste like pure despair. The bar was about the size of a deck of cards and was so dense that some soldiers claimed it could stop a bullet, whether it was in their pack or in their digestive system. The ingredients were, technically, food, chocolate, sugar, oat flour, and a small amount of cocoa fat. The final product was a brown brick that could be used as an emergency building material or a blunt instrument. It was made this way so it could endure the heat of the tropics, the cold of frozen landscapes, and the dryness of the desert without melting. The military had specifically requested that it be unappetizing, to ensure soldiers would only eat it in a true emergency when they were on the verge of starvation. In that, the mission was a success. The bar was so hard that attempting to bite into it without first softening it could result in a dental emergency. Some men tried to grate it into hot water to make a drink. Others simply stared at it, confused. Legend has it that a few even used it to hammer in their tent stakes. But it did contain about 600 calories, which was enough to keep a man going through a day of combat. If you were trapped behind enemy lines or stuck in a foxhole with only your rifle and a series of bad choices, the D-ration might just be the thing that saved your life. Emotionally, however, it offered very little comfort. To the Army's credit, they did eventually come to realize that providing troops with chocolate that could double as a brick was not beneficial for morale. Later versions of the D-ration were made slightly softer and a bit more edible. But the reputation was already sealed. Soldiers remembered the original bar with the same level of fondness one might have for dental surgery. So the next time you hear the phrase, "chocolate makes everything better," remember the D-ration, the one bar that proved the saying wrong. If the K-ration was designed for survival and the D-ration was a form of edible punishment, then the field kitchen represented a soldier's only opportunity to eat something warm, familiar, and only moderately disheartening. Field kitchens, sometimes referred to as rolling kitchens, were mobile food units that were towed behind trucks or pulled by horses. They were the military's attempt at providing a fine dining experience on the move, and by fine, we mean not cold and served out of a can. These mobile kitchens produced enormous vats of stew, beans, gravy-like concoctions, and enough coffee to fuel an entire infantry division through a period of deep existential reflection. Meals were served in a cafeteria-style line. Soldiers would line up holding their trusty mess kits, a metal tray that looked more suited for a science experiment, and move forward, hoping that the person in front of them wouldn't take the last scoop of whatever vaguely meat-colored substance was being served. The food was distributed with military precision. 1 scoop per person, accompanied by a suspicious glance, and then on to the next soldier. The menu varied depending on the location. In Europe, a soldier might receive creamed chipped beef on toast. This dish was affectionately and permanently renamed by the troops as SOS, or stuff on a shingle, though a less polite word was often used. In the Pacific Theater, you were considered lucky if the meal wasn't just rice mixed with fragments of hot dogs in a thin broth. Coffee, however, was treated as sacred. It was brewed strong, bitter, and in quantities large enough to revive the dead. Soldiers drank it hot or cold, black or with powdered milk. The important thing was that it kept them awake and ready. The best part of the field kitchen experience was the smell, as it signaled that food was on its way. The worst part was nearly everything else. Meals were eaten outdoors, often in the rain, snow, or in mud so thick it seemed to have its own ecosystem. Soldiers sat on rocks, their helmets, or directly on the ground. There were no forks and no ambience. It was just you, your comrades, and a tin of beans that might have been older than your commanding officer. Even so, when a meal was hot and at least somewhat chewable, the food from a field kitchen could feel like a taste of heaven. It was far from glamorous, but in a world filled with chaos, danger, and K-rations, it was the closest thing a soldier could get to comfort food. At the beginning of the Second World War, German soldiers went into battle with confidence, clean uniforms, and something quite rare in wartime: actual food that resembled real meals. The early war Wehrmacht ration was almost luxurious compared to what soldiers in most other armies were consuming. The standard issue pack for a soldier contained rye bread, sausages, butter, cheese, canned meats, marmalade, and a coffee substitute. Each soldier was expected to carry his own food for several days. This was a noble idea in theory, until you considered the immense weight it added to the rifles, ammunition, and grenades they already carried. Still, German rations were designed around the concept of 3 hot meals a day, with field kitchens following the troops like dedicated, albeit overworked, food trucks. A typical breakfast might consist of dark rye bread with jam or butter, along with that faux coffee made from roasted acorns. Lunch could be tinned meat, cheese, and perhaps a few boiled potatoes. For dinner, if a soldier was lucky and not under immediate fire, there might be soup or stew made from whatever was available that morning. Sausage, particularly metwurst and leberwurst, was a staple. It was easy to transport, rich in protein, and offered a degree of comfort. It also had an incredibly strong smell when opened in a sealed tin, which meant that every trench had a distinct aroma of iron, sweat, and spicy pork. And, of course, the Germans had bread. Good, real bread. Soldiers often spoke more fondly of losing access to proper bread than they did of losing a warm place to sleep. One Wehrmacht veteran described the ration bread as the only softness in an otherwise very sharp war. Field kitchens supported the system, producing steaming pots of stews, boiled meats, and dumplings whenever possible. Morale was high, stomachs were relatively full, and German efficiency seemed boundless. But this golden age of German rations was not destined to last. As the war expanded and supply lines became stretched to their limits, the quality of the food began to decline. The sausages went sour, the bread grew stale, and the once proud field kitchens found themselves stranded in frozen forests with little more than frozen potatoes and patriotic memories. Still, for a brief, sausage-filled period, the average German soldier experienced something precious in wartime: warm food, decent coffee substitutes, and the hopeful illusion that the conflict might be over by Christmas. As the Second World War continued and the dream of a swift victory faded into a logistical nightmare, German rations took a dramatic turn, entering the realm of Ersatz. Ersatz is a German word that essentially means substitute, or more accurately, this is not real food, but we are calling it that anyway. By 1942, the situation required some creativity. Real coffee was gone, replaced by ersatz coffee, a unique blend of roasted acorns, chicory, sugar beet, or barley. It had the scent of despair and a taste reminiscent of something brewed in an old boot. It only resembled coffee if you had never actually tasted coffee before and were feeling particularly charitable. Bread, which was once dark, hearty, and sustaining, was now filled with extenders like sawdust, straw, and potato starch. While it was still called bread, your teeth would have disagreed. Some soldiers joked that it could be used as padding inside their helmets. Butter also vanished, replaced by ersatz margarine, a pale, flavorless grease that managed to be both oily and chalky at the same time. Meat became a distant memory. Cans of meat product began to appear with labels that conveniently omitted the type of animal, and it was generally better not to ask. Even sausage, that sacred pillar of German cuisine, was diluted. Horse meat was introduced into the mix, followed by turnip filler. Eventually, some sausages were composed of up to 40% plant material. Imagine biting into a bratwurst and getting a mouthful of damp newspaper. That was the culinary reality of the declining Reich. The issue was not just the taste. These ersatz rations were deficient in nutrients, calories, and any ability to boost morale. Troops on the Eastern Front were burning thousands of calories a day in sub-zero temperatures, yet they were given food that would barely sustain a small dog. Starvation, illness, and desperation soon followed. Soldiers had to become inventive, boiling shoe leather for sustenance, bartering with local populations, or raiding enemy supply lines just to find something real to eat. A single American chocolate bar became more valuable than an entire loaf of Wehrmacht bread. What had started as an efficient, well-fueled war machine was now running on cabbage water and caffeine-free lies. The Germans had begun the war with real food. They were now chewing on misery and washing it down with a beverage made from roasted roots. If there was one place where food went to perish during World War II, it was the Eastern Front. This front stretched for thousands of miles, from Berlin to the deep, frozen expanses of Russia. Logistically, it was like trying to operate a pizza delivery service across a glacier while under constant fire from artillery, snipers, and the occasional hungry wolf pack. German soldiers who had once enjoyed sausage and rye bread now found themselves huddled in snowdrifts with frozen fingers and empty stomachs. Rations dwindled, supply lines broke down, and morale disappeared faster than the warmth from their soup, which is to say, it didn't last at all. Let's talk about that soup. A typical meal on the Eastern Front often consisted of hot water with a few potato peels, if you were lucky. If you were not so lucky, it was just water, which would freeze solid by the time it reached you. Bread, if it arrived at all, was often moldy. Meat was something that was only rumored to exist. Soldiers would burn precious firewood not to keep themselves warm, but to thaw their canned meat products, which could have been beef, pork, or perhaps just recycled optimism. If the label had worn off, you had to rely on your sense of smell to identify the contents. In the winter, men boiled snow for drinking water, heated tins on the engine blocks of vehicles, and sometimes ate snow out of pure desperation. This might sound harmless, but it actually lowers the body's core temperature, bringing a soldier one step closer to freezing to death with a mouthful of slush. Then there were the rats, bold, fat, and suspiciously well-fed. Some units resorted to catching and cooking them. Others saw the rats as competitors, fighting with them over scraps of food in midnight skirmishes that, mercifully, are not taught in history classes. Desperation also led to bartering. Soldiers would trade cigarettes for a piece of bread, buttons for a little sugar, or a pair of socks for half a boiled potato. A single spoonful of jam could incite a fight. If you possessed chocolate, you were treated like a god. Despite the hunger, the biting cold, and the complete lack of anything resembling a balanced diet, the soldiers endured. They told jokes, swore, and ate whatever they could find. But every mealtime became a somber ritual. Open the tin, offer a silent prayer, and hope that its contents wouldn't be as bad as the last. On the Eastern Front, food was not just in short supply. It was a cruel game of survival, played one frozen spoonful at a time. If the German troops on the Eastern Front were consuming misery, then the Soviet soldiers were sustained by sheer force of will. The Red Army's approach to nutrition was straightforward. If it could fill a stomach and did not cause immediate death, it was considered dinner. The official rations consisted of black bread, cabbage soup, buckwheat porridge known as kasha, a few boiled potatoes, perhaps some dried fish, and the ever-present unsweetened tea. In the winter, this tea was often just melted snow with a twig for flavor. Meat was listed on official documents, but in reality, it was as rare as finding a warm bath in Stalingrad. When meat did arrive, it was usually so heavily salted that chewing it was more of a workout for the jaw than a satisfying meal. Still, it was regarded as a luxury. Soldiers would lick the residual fat from empty meat tins just to savor the memory of it. Then there was the bread, a fundamental part of every Soviet meal. It was coarse, black, and made from whatever grain was still considered edible. It was also strictly rationed. A typical serving could fit in the palm of your hand and would be gone in 2 bites, unless you tried to make it last by licking it slowly, like a sad wartime lollipop. Cabbage was the undisputed hero of Soviet cuisine. Whether it was in soup, stew, stuffed, shredded, or fermented, if there was a pot, there was cabbage in it. There was so much cabbage that some Soviet soldiers joked they could smell it in their sleep and dreamed of becoming turnips, just to escape the relentless cycle. If you can imagine still being hungry after that, then you understand the Soviet wartime diet. Soldiers frequently went into combat underfed and overworked. Rations were supposed to be delivered daily, but in war-torn areas, this schedule changed to when possible, which often translated to never. So they improvised. Foraging became an essential skill for survival. Soldiers would dig up frozen potatoes from abandoned farms, hunt wild animals when they had the chance, and trade cigarettes or spare boots for a single boiled egg. Occasionally, they even traded with German prisoners of war, food in exchange for silence. The miracle in all of this is that they endured. Malnourished and exhausted, yet relentless, Soviet troops pushed forward, fueled by little more than boiled cabbage and fumes. It was a testament to the idea that sometimes what sustains a soldier is not calories, but pure, cabbage-fueled stubbornness. When official rations were depleted, which happened frequently, Soviet soldiers did not simply starve in silence. They adapted, often loudly, with a combination of creativity, desperation, and the culinary instincts of a raccoon. Red Army troops transformed battlefield improvisation into an extreme sport. Imagine you are a soldier stationed outside Leningrad. You have not seen a supply truck in a week. Your cabbage soup has been reduced to mere water with a single leaf floating in it, and your last piece of black bread has started to grow a beard. What are your options? The first is to forage. Soldiers would search the countryside for anything remotely edible. Berries, tree bark, boiled grass, dandelions, and even flower bulbs. One particularly resourceful unit discovered how to roast shoe leather. Not because it tasted good, because it did not, but because it was technically organic. The second option was to barter. A spare pair of socks might get you a potato. A broken watch might be worth a spoonful of lard. Tobacco was used as currency, and soap was as valuable as gold. If you were lucky enough to have a tin of meat, you could persuade someone to write a letter home for you and clean your rifle. The third option was theft, or as they referred to it, unauthorized logistics. Soviet soldiers would occasionally raid abandoned German outposts solely for the purpose of finding food. One Red Army veteran later recalled the intense euphoria of discovering a box of Wehrmacht sausages, saying, "It was the first time I cried and salivated at the same time." Field kitchens, when they were operational, were masters of mystery cooking. The cooks would throw in whatever they had on hand: beets, onions, mystery meat, and pickled vegetables that might have been preserved since 1913. The resulting soup was red, hot, and suspiciously chewy, but for the most part, it kept you going. And yet, morale did not collapse. The reason for this lies in the fact that Soviet culture often glorified suffering as a demonstration of strength. Soldiers turned their deprivation into a badge of honor. They told jokes about their rations and sang songs about dried fish. They even gave names to their tin cups, an act that could be seen as either a sign of camaraderie or a mild fever dream. In the Red Army, mealtime was not about flavor. It was a form of survival theater. Every bowl of borscht, Every crumb of bread was a declaration. We are still here. If the Second World War were to be judged solely on culinary performance, the British Army might have been forced to surrender to its own menu. British soldiers did not simply eat. They endured. Their rations represented a war within the larger war, a daily ritual of unseasoned punishment, consumed with eternal optimism and as much tea as a person could possibly drink. Let's begin with the sacred trinity of their diet: tea, hardtack biscuits, and bully beef. Tea was of the utmost importance. It was more than just a beverage, it was morale in liquid form. Soldiers would brew it in tin mugs, mess tins, helmets, anything that could hold heat and did not leak excessively. At times there was no milk, no sugar, and no dignity, just hot, brown water and hope. But it was enough to get them through. Hardtack biscuits were designed to outlast the soldier who carried them. They were dense, chalky, and almost completely without taste, possessing the structural integrity of roofing tiles. They could be used as plates, coasters, or even as makeshift armor in a pinch. Many soldiers claimed that their dental problems were not a result of combat, but of attempting to bite into these biscuits. Then there was the bully beef, also known as tinned corned beef. It had the visual appeal of canned cat food and the consistency of congealed regret. It was salty, oily, and could be eaten hot, cold, or with an appropriate level of emotional detachment. You could slice it, fry it, dice it, or simply stare at it until your appetite decided to leave the tent. The standard ration also included powdered eggs, which somehow tasted nothing like eggs, tin jam that could glue your jaw shut, and a small assortment of oatmeal, chocolate, and dried fruits. All of these items came in tins that required a crowbar and a prayer to open. The British Army did not pretend that its food was good. It simply pretended that it was sufficient, and to be fair, it did keep the soldiers alive, albeit just barely. Field kitchens could sometimes offer stews, stewed prunes, and the occasional pleasant surprise: a rail egg, a slice of bread, or something that was not immediately depressing. But regardless of the food, there was always tea. Bombs could fall and trucks could explode, but as long as there was hot water, a brew could be made. And in that steaming mug, held in a muddy trench, was Britain's greatest ration of all: stubbornness in a cup. By the middle of the war, British soldiers were not only fighting the Axis powers, they were also battling ration fatigue, an invisible enemy that arrived in the form of yet another tin of corned beef. The British military supply system was held together by string, hope, and a suspiciously large number of forms filled out in triplicate. The fact that they were fighting on multiple continents, from the deserts of North Africa to the mountains of Italy and the jungles of Burma, meant that the farther a soldier was from London, the weirder, colder, and often mushier the rations became. A ration pack in Cairo might arrive slightly warm and edible. A ration pack in the Burmese jungle, however, might arrive moldy, half-eaten by ants, and 2 weeks behind schedule. And yet, the soldiers would salute it, heat it, and eat it, because that was what British resilience looked like. Chewing quietly through despair. Water was always boiled. This was not just to kill bacteria, but because boiling water meant tea could be made. Tea was sacred. Men would risk sniper fire just to retrieve a kettle. A warm cup of tea could be the difference between a complete breakdown and a moment of British dignity in the mud. When supplies were scarce, which was often the case, soldiers became creative. They would rehydrate powdered milk to use as a whitener for their tea, spread jam on hardtack biscuits with their bayonets, and season their meat with sarcasm. One soldier was reported to have made a stew out of bully beef, raisins, and crushed vitamin tablets. The result was morally questionable, but it was technically food. Tinned food was both a blessing and a curse. It lasted forever, but it also required a great deal of strength, proper tools, and sometimes divine intervention to open. Soldiers developed strong opinions about the designs of the tins and would spend entire afternoons discussing the merits of the good K-roll ones versus the devil tins with no handles. When something fresh did appear, an egg, a loaf of bread, an actual vegetable, it was a cause for either celebration or suspicion. One soldier, upon receiving a fresh tomato, reportedly stared at it for an hour before deciding to keep it as a pet. Despite the rationing, the blandness, and the jaw pain induced by the biscuits, British troops remained stoic. They grumbled with dignity, made jokes about their own digestion, and, above all, kept calm and carried on, preferably with a cup of tea in hand. If the American soldier was defined by his rations, the German by his organization, and the Brit by his tea, then the Japanese soldier was defined by rice and a terrifying capacity for suffering. The Imperial Japanese Army was built on the principle of endurance. Soldiers were taught that self-denial was a noble virtue and that hunger was a part of their duty. This philosophy was convenient, as most of them were perpetually on the verge of starvation. The standard Japanese field ration was less of a meal and more of a polite suggestion. A typical pack contained white rice, barley, dried fish, pickled plums known as umebashi, soy sauce concentrate, and perhaps a few hard candies. It was compact, culturally familiar, and, in the conditions of the field, utterly insufficient. Initially, troops were sent out with several days' worth of rations, wrapped in wax paper or stored in bento-style metal tins. The arrangement looked neat, organized, and well thought out. But then they arrived in the jungle. In places like New Guinea, Burma, and Guadalcanal, the high humidity would turn the rice into a moldy goo. Rats would eat through their supplies, and the fish would spoil faster than their hopes of victory. To make matters worse, Japan's military logistics were, to put it generously, a disaster. Supply lines were overstretched, bombed, blockaded, or simply ceased to exist. Many units went for days and sometimes even weeks, with only a handful of rice to share among them. Soldiers resorted to foraging, raiding local villages, or eating jungle plants whose nutritional value ranged from slightly helpful to hallucinate and then collapse. In more desperate situations, they hunted lizards, insects, and even rats. One soldier claimed that they made a soup from boiled grass and boot leather just to keep their stomachs from growling. To their credit, or perhaps to their horror, Japanese troops rarely complained. They held the belief that hardship was honorable. Starving was seen as glorious. Being barefoot was inspirational. And if their rice was infested with weevils, it was simply considered added protein. Occasionally, they would have miso paste or powdered green tea. These items were prized and hoarded like wartime treasure. A teaspoon of tea could lift a soldier's spirits. A pinch of salt could bring someone to tears. But overall, their caloric intake was low, their suffering was high, and their morale often stemmed from sheer cultural discipline rather than from what passed for a meal. The Japanese soldier was not just underfed. He was trained to be okay with it. And somehow, many of them continued to fight, not because of what was in their bellies, but because of what was in their minds. The jungles of the Pacific appeared lush and green from a distance, like a tropical paradise. As long as you ignored the disease, the leeches, and the lingering scent of slow decay. But for the soldiers on both sides, and especially for the Japanese, the jungle was not a source of food. It was a leafy green death trap with high humidity and a hostile attitude. Supply lines in the Pacific were notoriously unreliable. Tropical storms, naval blockades, and enemy ambushes all conspired to make every delivery of rice, beans, or saltfish an act of incredible luck. And when the food failed to arrive, the jungle offered no comfort. Many Japanese units found themselves completely cut off from resupply for weeks at a time. Soldiers had to rely on the surrounding land, which would have been manageable if the land had been more cooperative. Unfortunately, the jungle was filled with plants that looked edible but were poisonous, animals that were edible but too fast to catch, and insects that were not only inedible but also actively aggressive. Rations would spoil within hours, canned goods would rust shut, and rice would grow mold faster than you could light a fire. One soldier on Guadalcanal wrote in his journal, "Everything here is wet. Even my appetite is damp." When they were lucky, what did they eat? Boiled roots, wild fruit, frogs, or jungle fowl if they managed to catch them. When they were unlucky, their meals consisted of tree bark, shoe leather, rotting palm stems, or water flavored with desperation. Stories exist of soldiers boiling the same handful of rice 3 times in order to extract every last bit of sustenance. Others would ferment whatever was left into a starchy, half-dead porridge that became known only as jungle glue. And then there were the horrifying rumors. Accounts of cannibalism among starving units, especially during long sieges. While it was not a widespread practice, it did happen. Men were driven to the absolute edge by war, isolation, and the gnawing emptiness of their stomachs. If anything can strip away the romanticism of the Pacific theater, it is that grim historical footnote. Disease followed closely behind starvation. Malaria, dysentery, and dengue fever were all made worse by malnutrition. Soldiers were falling not to bullets, but to hunger and infection, slowly and invisibly. The jungle did not care which side you fought for. It did not feed you. It did not shelter you. It simply waited for you to grow tired, and then it consumed you. War may have the power to destroy cities, but it also has the ability to unlock the culinary creativity of very hungry, very desperate people armed with bayonets and a single can of Spam. On every front of the war, soldiers did not just eat their rations. They negotiated with them. They bartered, swapped, stretched, crushed, fried, and sometimes even worshipped the more palatable parts. Food was not only fuel, it was also a form of entertainment and occasionally a mad science experiment. In American foxholes, GIs would turn their K-ration crackers into makeshift pancakes. They would mix them with powdered eggs and coffee creamer, and then fry the resulting batter over a small fire. The final product tasted of despair, but it was a warm despair which was at least somewhat comforting. Canned cheese would be melted into an oily paste over hot beans to create what they called trench fondue. Spam was sliced, pan-fried, and placed between two biscuits to make the world's saddest sandwich. Even chewing gum found new purposes, such as sealing leaky canteens or bribing a fellow soldier for an extra cigarette. British soldiers, armed with their indestructible hardtack biscuits and mystical jars of jam, would create jam buddy sandwiches by smashing two biscuits together with jam until their teeth could take no more. One squad in North Africa famously mixed their bully beef with dried fruit and called the concoction Desert Delight. Another group named their nightly stew simply Stuff, because no one, not even the cook, could identify its contents anymore. On the Eastern Front, Soviet soldiers would use empty shell casings as soup pots, boil cabbage in their helmets, and roast anything that had legs, including, on one occasion, a stolen German sausage that required 3 men to defend it. Even the Japanese, despite their limited supplies, found ways to repurpose their leftovers. Rice was refried with pickled vegetables to create onigiri rice-style cakes, and dried seaweed was hoarded to flavor water when nothing else was available. These were not gourmet meals. They were acts of wartime alchemy. Field improvisation turned boredom into a boost for morale. Turned not enough into this will have to do. And it made a lot of the food slightly less terrifying. Because when you are stuck in a trench, a jungle, or a ruined farmhouse, your mess kit becomes your kitchen, your bayonet becomes a spatula, and your meal becomes a small miracle that you survived long enough to eat. Long after the guns had fallen silent, long after the uniforms were packed away and the medals were stored in drawers, one thing remained with the veterans of World War II: the food. Or, more accurately, the memory of the food. For many soldiers, their rations were more than just sustenance. They were the backdrop to their experiences of trauma, camaraderie, grief, boredom, and hope. A single bite of bully beef could transport a veteran back to a foxhole in France. The faint smell of cabbage soup could evoke the memory of the frozen trenches outside Stalingrad. A can of Spam was not just meat. It was a moment frozen in time. Some remembered their meals with a dark sense of humor. American vets would joke about choking down a D-ration as if it owed them money. British troops would swap stories about trying to trade their hardtack biscuits with locals, only to be met with laughter. One Soviet veteran claimed that he could not bring himself to eat bread for years after the war, not because he hated it, but because it felt like sacred ground to him. Food marked the boundaries of war. A fresh apple signified that you were near a farm and perhaps closer to peace. A hot stew from a field kitchen meant that you were not going to die that day. Even a cup of bad coffee meant that someone had cared enough to boil water for you. Then there were the care packages, those precious, morale-boosting gifts from home. They contained chocolate bars, dried fruit, powdered milk, and handwritten notes tucked beside homemade cookies. These were not just treats. They were emotional lifelines. Some soldiers would hoard them, while others would share them freely. A few would ration them out, one bite at a time, stretching out a little bit of hope over weeks of horror. And yet, some flavors lingered for far too long. Veterans would joke that they could still taste the metal from the tins decades later. One GI swore that he could still smell Spam every time it rained. Another insisted that his nightmares occasionally featured powdered eggs. Because when you eat in a time of war, you are not just feeding your body, you are anchoring your existence. You are trying to remain human in a world that has gone mad. And that means that every meal, no matter how bland or bizarre, becomes a part of you. So, the next time you casually toss a snack into the microwave, take a moment to think of those soldiers, cooking their meals with firewood, bayonets, and sheer determination. For them, every bite was an act of survival, and the taste of it was something that never truly left them. The ink had barely dried on the US Constitution when the young republic found itself facing its first major crisis. This crisis did not come from foreign invaders or political disputes, but from something far more potent: whiskey. In the early 1790s, America was financially broken. The Revolutionary War had left the nation buried under a mountain of debt, and the new federal government, under the leadership of President George Washington and Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, desperately needed a solution. Hamilton, always the fiscal strategist, proposed an excise tax on distilled spirits produced within the country, with whiskey being the most common. To the urban elites and coastal merchants, this seemed like a reasonable measure. But on the western frontier, it felt like a direct assault from a distant, powdered Whig aristocracy. In the western regions, such as western Pennsylvania, whiskey was not just a beverage, it was a form of currency. Farmers would distill their surplus grain into whiskey because it was easier to transport, less likely to spoil, and far more profitable than selling the raw crops. Bartering with whiskey for goods and services was a common part of daily life. So, when the federal government began to tax it, many people on the frontier saw it not as a way to generate revenue, but as a betrayal. It was a reminder that power was once again concentrating in a distant authority, the very kind they had just fought a revolution to escape from. To make matters worse, the structure of the tax itself seemed specifically designed to disadvantage small-scale producers. Large distilleries had the option to pay a flat annual fee, but smaller distillers, like those in the Appalachian Hills, were required to pay by the gallon. This meant that, proportionally, the small-time farmer paid more. As federal tax collectors began to arrive on horseback to enforce this new law, tensions started to boil over. At first, the resistance was minor. Inspectors were threatened, tax documents were burned, and revenue officers were politely advised to get lost. But soon, polite turned to violent. The practice of tarring and feathering made a comeback. Taxmen were chased from their homes. In one instance, a revenue officer was stripped naked, tied to a tree, and had his hair cut off. A form of frontier justice fueled by moonshine and rage. And all the while, Washington was watching, waiting silently, but not for long. What had begun as a simple tax protest was on the verge of spiraling into an armed uprising, one that would test the strength of the Constitution and Washington's resolve to uphold it. By 1792, the whiskey tax was not just unpopular, it was radioactive. In the backwoods communities of Pennsylvania, Kentucky, and Virginia, the opposition was transforming from scattered grumblings into a coordinated act of defiance. Tax collectors were becoming all too familiar with the sounds of breaking windows and the sharp crack of gunfire overhead. The western counties of Pennsylvania became the epicenter of what many were now calling an outright rebellion. Meetings were held in taverns and cabins, where kegs of homemade whiskey stood proudly beside muskets. These were not just drunken complaints, they were organized gatherings. Locals formed their own militias, issued threats against federal officials, and even passed their own resolutions condemning the tax. Some refused to do business with anyone who complied with it. It was a movement that was part protest, part mafia, with a side of corn liquor. In 1793, the situation escalated even further. Tax collectors and their sympathizers were ambushed, whipped, and publicly humiliated. One man was captured and paraded through town with a sign that read, "Coward, hung around his neck. It was like the Boston Tea Party, but with more alcohol and worse hygiene. The federal courts responded by issuing summonses to bring the rebels to justice. But serving legal papers in a place where the local sheriff might be a part of the mob was a difficult task. The region was effectively descending into lawlessness, as local officials either turned a blind eye or quietly sided with the insurgents. President Washington, normally a calm and measured man, was beginning to grit his false teeth. The Whiskey Rebellion was threatening not only public order but also the very legitimacy of federal law. If the government could not enforce its own taxes, then what was the purpose of having a constitution? What was the purpose of government itself? Still, Washington did not act hastily. He sent federal commissioners to negotiate with the rebels. But it was like trying to serve tea during a bar fight. The rebels had already formed committees, held conventions, and in some cases were even discussing full-on secession. They saw themselves not as criminals, but as patriots standing up against tyranny. Meanwhile, Hamilton, ever the hawk, was whispering in Washington's ear, "Are you really going to let these guys stomp on the Constitution after everything we just went through?" And so Washington made a decision, one that would shock the rebels and set a historic precedent. He would raise a federal army to march against his own people. By 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion had become more than just a backwoods tantrum. It was an open challenge to federal authority. George Washington, who had led a revolution just a decade earlier, now found himself in the strange position of leading an army against his fellow Americans, the very citizens he had helped to liberate. And this was no small militia. Washington called for more than 12,000 troops, a force nearly 3 times the size of the one he had commanded at the Battle of Trenton. This army included state militias from Maryland, New Jersey, Virginia, and Pennsylvania. While many of these soldiers were volunteers, others were voluntold to serve. It was the largest federal force that had ever been assembled in the United States up to that point. And it was not marching to war against the British or the French. It was marching west to put down a group of angry farmers armed with pitchforks and moonshine stills. Hamilton, never one to miss a dramatic moment, rode out with the army, looking like a powdered wig version of General Patton. He was thrilled. This was his big chance to show that the federal government had teeth and was not afraid to use them. Washington, though reluctant, understood what was at stake. The rebellion was not just about alcohol. It was about whether the United States could function as a nation governed by law. If the rebels could successfully intimidate tax collectors and defy Congress without facing any consequences, then the Constitution might as well be used for kindling. So, for the first and only time in American history, a sitting president led troops in the field. Imagine the scene. The most famous man in America, on horseback, riding westward through the Allegheny Mountains, not to inspire a revolution, but to crush one. His presence sent a chilling message. Rebellion would be met not with pamphlets, but with bayonets. When the army approached the heart of the rebel territory in western Pennsylvania, the response was anticlimactic. The rebels who had talked so boldly in taverns and had burned down a few tacksmen's houses suddenly remembered they had chores to do. Most of the ringleaders vanished. Others fled into the woods or adopted the "I don't know anything about anything" defense. There would be no great battle, no climactic showdown. The army had marched hundreds of miles to confront a rebellion that had fizzled out like flat cider. But Washington's message was loud and clear. The federal government was not a joke. With the rebellion effectively smothered before a single shot was fired, the soldiers turned around and headed home. And so did George Washington. But now came the aftermath. Arrests, trials, and justice, federal style. A handful of rebel leaders were captured, though calling them leaders might be a generous term, as many of the more radical agitators had already slipped away into the wilderness. What remained were a few unlucky men who were caught due to bad timing or poor hiding spots. 20 of these men were eventually brought to Philadelphia to stand trial for treason. However, the trials did not unfold as Hamilton might have hoped. The evidence was spotty, and witnesses were afraid to testify. The jury, made up of their fellow Pennsylvanians, was not exactly eager to send their neighbors to the gallows. In the end, only 2 men were convicted of treason, and even that verdict was met with a degree of skepticism. These were not dangerous warlords. They were poor farmers who had made some very poor decisions. And Washington, who was no stranger to rebellion himself, chose mercy over vengeance. In a move that stunned some and reassured others, he pardoned both men. His message was clear. Yes, the government would enforce the law, but it would not become a tyrant in the process. This act of clemency turned out to be just as important as the show of force itself. Washington had demonstrated strength, but he had also shown restraint. The federal government was not going to crush its people under its heel like a monarchy might have. Instead, it would lead by the rule of law tempered with justice. Meanwhile, Hamilton grumbled. He had wanted more heads to roll, metaphorically if not literally. He saw the rebellion as proof that the common folk could not be trusted with too much freedom, especially when whiskey was involved. But Washington understood the deeper game. Legitimacy did not come from cracking skulls. It came from showing that the new republic could balance authority with compassion. The rebellion was over, but the precedent it set would echo for generations. The United States had passed its first real test of federal authority, and it had not collapsed into chaos. Still, questions remained. Would future presidents use the same logic? Would mercy always follow power? And most importantly, was this the end of frontier rebellion, or just the beginning? The guns were holstered, the rebels were pardoned, and the whiskey stills in the hills quietly resumed their bubbling. But politically, the whiskey rebellion left a hangover that would linger for years. The event had proven that the federal government possessed the power to enforce its laws. But it also ignited the deep political divisions that were already smoldering beneath the surface. At the heart of the conflict were two opposing visions for America. On one side stood Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists, proponents of order, commerce, a strong central government, and powdered Whigs that could stop a bullet. They saw the rebellion as confirmation that the unruly countryside needed to be firmly managed. On the other side were the Jeffersonian Republicans, who were deeply distrustful of centralized power. They believed in the ideal of the yeoman farmer, local control, and resisting the kind of government overreach they had fought a revolution to escape. To them, the federal response to the Whiskey Rebellion was not a heroic act of law enforcement. It was an overreaction. Sending 12,000 troops to deal with a few farmers and their barrels of corn mash felt like using a cannon to stomp on a fly. Thomas Jefferson, who was serving as Washington's vice president at the time, did not hold back his opinions. Privately, he referred to the federal march as a monarchical adventure. He believed that Washington's show of force only served to push the common man further away from the government and directly into the arms of the Republican cause. And indeed, in the aftermath of the rebellion, something curious happened. The Republican Party began to gain momentum. Out on the frontier, where a distrust of federal authority had been fermenting like whiskey itself, support for Jefferson's ideals surged. These were no longer just drunk and angry farmers. They were voters, and they were angry about being treated like a band of criminals for refusing to pay a tax they could barely afford. The rebellion had failed on a military level, but it succeeded in galvanizing anti-federalist sentiment. It helped to accelerate the formation of the first true political parties in America, sharpening the divide between those who favored a strong, centralized state and those who wanted the states to have the power to call their own shots. So, while no war had broken out, a new kind of battle had begun. One that was fought not with muskets and torches, but with ballots, speeches, and ideology. At its core, the Whiskey Rebellion was not just about alcohol. It was about power and class resentment. For the small farmers of western Pennsylvania and beyond, the whiskey tax was more than just an annoying expense. It was a symbol of everything they feared about the new federal government, that it would be run by elites for elites at the expense of the working poor. Many of the rebellion's participants were not outlaws. They were veterans of the Revolutionary War, men who had fought and bled for a republic that they now felt was turning its back on them. They had returned from the battlefields only to discover that the very government they had helped to establish was now squeezing them dry, all while cozying up to the bankers and merchants of the East. It was like fighting off a lion, only to come home and be kicked by the house cat. To make matters worse, many people on the frontier felt deliberately excluded from the political process. Representation was lopsided, and their voices were often drowned out by wealthier, urban politicians who had no understanding of what life was like west of the Appalachian Mountains. When you added taxes that disproportionately punished small producers to the mix, the whole situation smelled less like economic policy and more like class warfare with the faint scent of whiskey. There was also the issue of how the law was enforced. Wealthier distillers could afford to hire lawyers, deal with the paperwork, and pay the annual flat fee. But the poor man with a single still and 6 barrels of mash? He was met by a federal marshal and faced a potential prison sentence. The optics were terrible and the anger was very real. In this sense, the rebellion served as an early warning sign. Class tension was not going to simply disappear just because America had a constitution. If anything, the struggle between wealthy centers of power and rural working communities was baked into the cake. The Whiskey Rebellion was just the first slice. Interestingly, some of the more radical rebels even adopted the language of the French Revolution, which was happening around the same time. They spoke of liberty, tyranny, and the rights of man. To Washington and Hamilton, this kind of rhetoric was terrifying. The last thing they wanted was a peristyle bloodbath spilling over into the Ohio Valley. But to the Whiskey rebels, these words were not dangerous. They were a promise they felt had already been broken. George Washington's decision to personally lead troops into western Pennsylvania was as bold as it was risky. At the time, many Americans viewed the presidency as a somewhat distant, almost ceremonial role, a sort of executive moderator for a government that was still figuring itself out. But with this march, Washington shattered that image. He was not a passive figurehead. He was an active enforcer of federal power. For Washington, the Whiskey Rebellion was a test not just of law and order, but of the very legitimacy of the federal system itself. He had helped to design the Constitution, and now he was putting it to the work it was intended for. If he failed, if he allowed violence and intimidation to override legislation, the entire project could unravel. The 13 separate states could quickly decide that they were better off going their own separate ways. In that light, the rebellion was not just a backwoods tantrum. It was the canary in the Democratic coal mine. Washington's personal involvement added enormous weight to the situation. His reputation was almost mythical. He was revered by veterans, respected by citizens, and feared by his enemies. When word spread that Washington himself was riding west, many of the rebels simply melted into the landscape. Some could not believe it. They thought, Washington was the hero of liberty. Now he's marching on citizens over a tax on whiskey. But Washington's gamble paid off. He did not need to fire a single shot to win. His mere presence was enough to restore order, and he knew when to stop. Once the rebellion had dissolved, he withdrew his forces. He did not occupy the region, he did not punish the masses, and he did not turn it into a show trial. He simply reminded everyone, in a firm manner, that the law was not optional. Yet not everyone applauded his actions. Some, particularly those in the Jeffersonian camp, accused Washington of using military force to silence legitimate political dissent. They painted the march as an overreaction, a flexing of executive muscle that could have easily turned ugly. Even some Federalists worried about the precedent that had just been set. Still, the swift collapse of the rebellion allowed Washington to exit the presidency on a high note. He had enforced the law without becoming a tyrant. He had shown strength without resorting to cruelty. But quietly, Washington understood that this would not be the last time America's unity would be tested. And the next time, the outcome might not be so bloodless. Although the Whiskey Rebellion ended with little more than a whimper, its echoes rippled far and wide, affecting the political, legal, and cultural landscape of the nation. In hindsight, this dusty conflict over distilled grain was one of the most important constitutional stress tests in the history of the United States. First, it set a critical precedent. The federal government had both the right and the ability to enforce its laws, even in the face of violent opposition. Before this event, the Constitution had been more of a theory than a reality. The Articles of Confederation had demonstrated just how weak and toothless a decentralized government could be. Now, with Washington's boots on the ground, the Constitution flexed its newfound muscles. But with that power came a lingering fear. Many Americans, especially those in rural areas, began to see the federal government not as a representative of their will, but as a distant Eastern elite that neither understood nor cared about life on the frontier. The very same people who had once cheered for the revolution now whispered about oppression coming from Philadelphia and New York, instead of from London. Culturally, the Whiskey Rebellion became the stuff of legend in the Appalachian Hills. Stories were passed down through generations about brave distillers who stood up to federal agents. Some of these stories were exaggerated, some were romanticized, but they all carried the same underlying message. The government doesn't always have your back. And if you want something done, sometimes it takes more than just a vote. It takes a still, a rifle, and a few angry neighbors. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., a new capital that was being planned during the aftermath of the rebellion, lawmakers were taking notes. Future leaders would reference the Whiskey Rebellion every time civil unrest threatened the balance of the republic. They would ask themselves, was this the model to follow? A rapid show of force followed by clemency? Or was it a dangerous precedent of executive overreach? And then there was the whiskey itself. Ironically, despite the failure of the rebellion, the tax itself never really worked. It was expensive to enforce, widely evaded, and politically poisonous. By the early 1800s, under the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, it was quietly repealed. The rebels may have lost the battle, but in a twisted sort of way, they had won the war of public opinion. The frontier did not forget. Neither did the government. And future presidents would face their own rebellions, both large and small, with the ghost of 1794 riding just behind them, reminding them that order is fragile and that the republic is always just one barrel away from boiling over. The Whiskey Rebellion may seem like a curious footnote in history today, a quirky chapter in the early American story, but its legacy remains surprisingly alive. It swirls like vapor rising from a still, influencing everything from presidential power to the spirit of rural resistance. For one, it demonstrated to the American people that the Constitution was not just a document of parchment and promises. It had muscle. This was the first time the federal government had used troops to enforce a domestic law, and the fact that it was done under the personal leadership of George Washington gave the event historical gravity. Every president since has inherited that precedent. From Lincoln and Eisenhower to even recent presidents deploying the National Guard during times of domestic unrest, there is a faint line that can be traced back to 1794 and a president on horseback. The rebellion also injected a lasting skepticism into the heart of American politics. The frontier's distrust of centralized government became a core component of the U.S. political identity. It did not matter that the rebellion had failed. It had proven to millions of people that distant elites could and would flex their power whenever it suited them. That spirit of rural defiance can still be heard today in anti-tax protests, arguments for states' rights, and the deep-seated American love for local control. In short, the rebellion planted seeds of resistance that never quite died out. They simply fermented over time. Whiskey itself, believe it or not, also reaped a strange and lasting legacy. Far from being demonized, it became a symbol of independence and grit. The very substance that had sparked a rebellion is now toasted in bars as a proud American tradition. In fact, the American whiskey industry, particularly bourbon and rye, wears its rebellious roots like a badge of honor. You can find distilleries named after rebellion leaders, bottles designed to evoke the spirit of the frontier, and slogans that practically dare the IRS to come knocking again. And finally, the event taught a young country something fundamental. How it responds to dissent says everything about its identity. Washington chose a path of both force and forgiveness. That balance, power tempered by principle, became a cornerstone of the American ideal. It has not always been followed, of course, but it is always referenced. So, the next time you raise a glass of bourbon or rye, remember, it is not just liquor in that bottle. It is a story of power, protest, and a young republic figuring out what kind of country it was going to be. Cheers to the rebellion that helped to define a nation. Around the year 1754 BCE, King Hammurabi of Babylon had his now famous code of laws etched into a massive basalt stele. This towering legal monument was intended to awe his subjects and assert a sense of divine justice. It stands as one of the earliest known attempts to formalize laws in human history. But buried within its 282 articles is something just as ancient as the law itself: the regulation of women. In Hammurabi's Babylon, a woman was not just a person. She was a role. She was a daughter, a wife, a widow, or a mother. Each of these roles came with its own legal definition, a set of social expectations, and, if things went wrong, a prescribed punishment. Let's consider marriage, for example. Women could be married off by their fathers, which was essentially a transfer from one household to another. Once a woman was married, she was expected to be faithful. If she was accused of adultery, both she and her alleged lover could be bound and thrown into a river. This was not a metaphor. It was literally what the text prescribed. However, if her husband chose to spare her life, the court would often agree, which is a grimly romantic notion. Meanwhile, if a man cheated on his wife, Hammurabi's code did not seem to be particularly concerned. Male infidelity was not exactly headline news in Mesopotamia. The imbalance was stark. A woman's honor was tied to her family's honor, while a man's honor was a more flexible concept. But not all of the laws were oppressive. Some provisions offered surprising protections for women, especially for widows. A widow had the right to remain in her late husband's house and manage his property until her sons came of age. If there were no sons, she could even inherit the property directly. In this way, Hammurabi's code recognized a woman's capacity for financial and legal responsibility, but only within the strict confines of the family structure. There were also laws concerning divorce. A woman could leave her husband if he was cruel or neglectful, but proving such claims was no easy task. If her allegations could not be verified, she could be branded a liar and punished severely. Justice was not blind. It just squinted a little harder when the accused was a woman wearing a veil. So, what does Hammurabi's code teach us about the lives of women in ancient Babylon? It shows us that they were not invisible. Far from it. They were named, categorized, judged, and occasionally protected, but always through the lens of control. The law gave them a place in society, but it rarely gave them the power to shape that place for themselves. If we travel a few hundred miles to the west of Babylon and fast forward a few centuries, we arrive in ancient Egypt. This was a civilization where the scales of justice were personified by Ma'at, the goddess of truth, balance, and cosmic order. And unlike many of their neighbors, the Egyptians held a surprisingly progressive view, at least on paper, when it came to the legal rights of women. Egyptian women, whether they were rich or poor, had the legal right to own property, inherit land, sue and be sued, and even initiate a divorce. These were not just theoretical rights etched onto the walls of tombs. They were actively practiced, particularly in urban centers like Thebes and Memphis. Women could enter into contracts, serve as witnesses in legal proceedings, and leave their own wills. A woman could run a business, lend money, or purchase slaves and livestock. In short, Egyptian law recognized women as legal individuals, not just as extensions of their husbands. This level of autonomy might seem far ahead of its time, and in many ways it was. Women were not barred from temples or courts. In fact, priestesses played important legal and ritualistic roles, and some even served as judges or scribes. Legal documents from the New Kingdom period show women filing complaints against their male relatives and winning their cases. But, as is often the case, this relative legal freedom came with its own set of social constraints. Most women still lived under the authority of a father or a husband, and while they could own land, they were often expected to pass it down to their male heirs. The law may have said, yes, but society often said, not quite. Marriage, though not a religious institution in Egypt, was still a legally binding contract. Husbands and wives could divorce for a variety of reasons, including infertility, infidelity, or even emotional incompatibility. Divorce did not carry a social stigma, and the children were usually cared for by the mother. She would retain the rights to her dowry and often received additional property as part of the settlement. Punishment under the law was theoretically equal for both men and women, but in practice, class and connections mattered far more than gender. A noblewoman could get away with actions that would send a peasant woman straight to the crocodiles. Literally. So, Was ancient Egypt a feminist utopia? Not exactly. But when compared to the rigid patriarchies of Mesopotamia or later Greece, it offered women something quite rare: the ability to participate in legal life as people, not just as property. In a world ruled by gods and pharaohs, that was no small thing. In ancient India, the legal world of women was governed by dharma, the moral and social order that lies at the heart of Hindu philosophy. This framework, codified in texts like the Manusmriti or the Laws of Manu, created a deeply hierarchical and duty-driven system in which women were honored, protected, and respected, as long as they remained in their designated place. The Manusmriti, which was compiled sometime between 200 BCE and 200 CE, had a great deal to say about women, much of which was contradictory. On one page, it would declare that, where women are honored, the gods rejoice, but on another, it would warn that a woman must never be independent. The tone of the text swung between reverence and restriction, between divine praise and domestic captivity. Legally, women were bound to male guardians throughout their entire lives. A woman was under the care of her father during childhood, her husband during marriage, and her sons during widowhood. This triad of male control was not just a cultural norm, it was encoded into the law. Autonomy was not the ideal, obedience was. The laws surrounding marriage were particularly rigid. A woman's primary duty was to marry, bear sons, and faithfully serve her husband. The remarriage of widows was generally frowned upon and, in some cases, outright banned, depending on the caste and the historical period. The infamous practice of sati, where widows were expected to throw themselves onto their husband's funeral pyre, was not universally enforced, but it did find moral validation in some legal and religious texts. The Manusmriti did not command it, but it also did not condemn it. That being said, there were exceptions to these rules. Women of the upper castes sometimes received an education and could inherit property if there were no male heirs. In some regions and time periods, matrilineal traditions survived, particularly in the South. Women could also serve as advisors, poets, and even rulers, though these were rare and exceptional cases. Divorce was uncommon and generally disapproved of, although certain grounds, such as impotence, cruelty, or abandonment, were sometimes recognized. Still, it was the man who had more legal freedom to dissolve a marriage. Punishments were also gendered. A woman who was caught in adultery could be disfigured or cast out of society. A man? He might receive a fine or a slap on the wrist, especially if he held a high social status. In short, ancient Hindu law enveloped women in layers of both veneration and restriction. They were considered sacred, but sacred in the way a temple statue is, not like a free citizen. They were revered, but rarely empowered. When we think of ancient Greece, our minds often turn to democracy, philosophy, and drama. But for half of the population, the women, the legal system was less about high ideals and more about complete invisibility. Especially in classical Athens, women were legally regarded not as individuals, but as permanent minors, forever bound to the guardianship of their closest male relative. In Athenian law, a woman could not vote, own property independently, or represent herself in a court of law. She was unable to enter into contracts or even leave her own house without a male escort. While the Code of Hammurabi defined women as legally subordinate, Athens, in many ways, perfected the art of locking them out of the legal system entirely. Marriage was more of a property transaction than a romantic union. A woman's kyrios, usually her father or brother, would arrange her marriage, and she would move into her husband's household as part of an exchange of dowries and land. Legally, she was transferred from one man to another much like livestock, a living, breathing asset. And yet, paradoxically, her fidelity was of immense legal importance. If an Athenian woman committed adultery, her husband could legally divorce her on the spot, and any man who was caught with her could be executed. Yes, executed without a trial. The irony in this was that her husband could sleep with courtesans or enslaved women without facing any legal repercussions. Double standards were not just common, they were intricately woven into the legal structure. Women could not initiate a divorce themselves, but they could return to their father's house if they were abandoned or mistreated. However, any legal action taken on their behalf had to be initiated by a male relative. Even in cases of rape or assault, A woman could not bring charges against her attacker. Her Kyrios had to speak for her. There were some exceptions to these rules. In Sparta, women enjoyed a greater degree of freedom. They could own land, receive an education, and walk about freely in public. But the Spartan woman was the anomaly, not the rule. In most of the other city-states, a respectable woman's name was meant to be spoken as little as possible. The ideal woman was modest, silent, and invisible. And yet, in the shadows of Greek law, women endured. They raised generations, managed households, and, in some rare instances, wielded influence from behind the veil of legality. But officially, they were not citizens. They were shadows in a system that prized logic and liberty, but only for men. In the world of ancient Rome, the law was a powerful instrument. And like everything else Roman, it was deeply structured, hierarchical, and pragmatic. By any stretch of the imagination, Roman women were not equal citizens. But when compared to their Greek counterparts, they occupied a slightly more visible and legally complex space within their society. At birth, a Roman woman fell under the patria potestas, or the absolute authority of her father. When she married, that authority could either be transferred to her husband, in what was known as a manus marriage, or it could remain with her natal family, in a sine manu marriage. The latter became increasingly common over time and allowed married women to retain legal ties to their original household and, in some cases, even manage their own property independently. This shift opened the door for women, especially widows or wealthy daughters, to own estates, manage businesses, and draft their own contracts. While women could not vote or hold public office, they could sue in court, often with a male sponsor, act as guardians, and accumulate wealth. Still, Roman law drew a firm line around a woman's behavior. The ideal Roman woman was pudica, modest, loyal, and obedient. Adultery, which was once treated as a private offense, became a public crime under the moral reforms of Emperor Augustus. A woman who was found guilty could lose her dowry, face exile, or worse. Meanwhile, a man's infidelity remained a legally unproblematic issue. Once again, patriarchy rarely missed an opportunity to reinforce its double standards. However, there were unique roles that offered exceptions to these rules. The Vestal Virgins, the priestesses of the goddess Vesta, were the only women who were legally free from male guardianship. They took a vow of chastity for 30 years in exchange for immense prestige, legal independence, and the power to pardon condemned prisoners. But if they broke their vow of chastity, they would be buried alive. Divine authority came with cruel consequences. Roman matrons, respectable, married women of the upper classes, held significant social power. They could influence politics through their family connections, arrange marriages, and even participate in public mourning rituals. The legal system acknowledged their status by providing protections for their property and creating legal mechanisms like tutela, a type of male guardianship that, by the imperial period, was often merely symbolic. So, while Roman women lived within a legal cage, the bars were spaced just far enough apart to allow for some movement, especially for those who were born into wealth and prestige. They were constrained, yes, but they were never entirely silenced. In ancient Hebrew society, the law was not just a civic structure. It was divine instruction, found in the Torah and later interpreted by rabbis. These religious legal texts created a framework that governed every aspect of life, including the roles, rights, and restrictions that were placed on women. And like many other ancient systems, the law both elevated and limited them. At the heart of Hebrew law was the family unit, and women were expected to serve as the moral and spiritual backbone of the household, but always under the authority of a man. Fathers arranged the marriages. Husbands were the heads of the households, and sons inherited the land. Daughters, in contrast, were expected to marry and leave the family home, bringing a dowry with them. They often had no inheritance rights, unless there were no sons in the family. However, women were far from voiceless. The ketubah, a marriage contract, provided them with legal security in the form of promised financial support and clearly spelled out the responsibilities within the marriage. If a man failed to provide his wife with food, clothing, or intimacy, she could seek a divorce, a rare provision in the ancient world. But she could not initiate the divorce directly. A rabbinic court or her male relatives had to advocate on her behalf. The laws regarding adultery were starkly unequal. According to Deuteronomic law, a married woman who was caught with another man could be stoned to death. A man who was caught with a married woman faced the same punishment. But if the woman was unmarried or a slave, the rules became much murkier, usually resulting in fines or a forced marriage, depending on the social status of those involved. In cases of rape, the law demanded that the perpetrator pay a fine and marry his victim, an outcome that modern readers understandably find deeply problematic. Ritual purity laws also played a massive role in how women were legally perceived. During menstruation or after childbirth, women were considered ritually impure and were temporarily restricted from participating in religious life and from physical contact. These laws reinforced the idea of female otherness, not necessarily as something sinful, but as something symbolically set apart. And yet, the Hebrew Bible is full of strong, legally significant women. Deborah, the judge; Ruth, the Moabite widow who skillfully navigates the inheritance system; and Esther, who bends royal law to save her people. These women were rare, but their presence reveals that the law was not always airtight, and that boldness, wisdom, and faith could sometimes create space where the law had closed a door. The Achaemenid Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE, ruled over a vast and diverse population, which included Babylonians, Egyptians, Greeks, and Medes. And within that sprawling empire, Persian law operated with a level of tolerance and pragmatism that was uncommon in many other ancient societies. This legal flexibility extended to women in some interesting ways. While Persian law was not codified in a single monument like Hammurabi's Code, administrative records, court documents, and inscriptions reveal that women, especially those of the elite class, had a considerable legal presence. In particular, Persian royal and noble women were among the most autonomous women in the ancient world. In the royal court, women like Atossa, the daughter of Cyrus the Great and the mother of Xerxes, wielded immense influence. She controlled vast estates, issued commands to administrators, and appeared in imperial inscriptions not as mere decorative figures, but as powerful landowners and key players in the political landscape. Records from the Persepolis fortification tablets show women receiving rations, managing work crews, and overseeing production on royal estates. These were not isolated cases. High-ranking women, especially those who were close to the king, held legal authority over both labor and property. The laws regarding marriage and family in Persia combined local customs with a broader imperial oversight. In Persian society, women could own property, enter into contracts, and inherit land, rights that were sometimes even more secure than those held by women in Greece or Rome. Dowries were legally protected, and women could reclaim them if their marriage ended. Divorce was possible for both men and women, though the process often favored the husband, unless serious abuse or infertility could be proven. The laws regarding punishment, however, were still gendered. Adultery was a capital offense, especially for women. But unlike in some of the neighboring cultures, the method and severity of the punishment varied by class. A noblewoman might face exile or house arrest, while a servant could be executed. The law, as it always has, bowed to hierarchy. Zoroastrianism, the dominant religion of the empire, also influenced the Persian views on women. While spiritually, both men and women had roles to play in the cosmic dualism of the religion, practical religious purity laws imposed restrictions related to menstruation, childbirth, and bodily contact, echoing the patterns seen in the Hebrew and Hindu systems. In all, Persian law offered women a curious mix of freedom through rank, respect through religion, and limits through custom. The higher your status, the louder your legal voice. In ancient China, the law was not just a system of rules. It was an expression of harmony, hierarchy, and Confucian morality. For women, this meant living within a legal and cultural framework that viewed them primarily through the lens of their family roles and social duties, rather than as individuals with their own rights. The earliest codified Chinese laws appeared during the Zhou dynasty, but it was under the Han dynasty, from 206 BCE to 220 CE, that the legal structures began to crystallize alongside the ideology of Confucianism. Confucian teachings emphasized the three obediences: A woman must obey her father before she is married, her husband during her marriage, and her sons in her widowhood. This was not just moral advice. It heavily influenced the actual legal expectations and societal norms of the time. In nearly all contexts, women were legally subordinate to men. They could not hold public office, they rarely appeared in court independently, and they were often excluded from inheritance, especially in patrilineal families. A daughter might be cherished within her own home, but the law saw her as a temporary member of the family. She would eventually marry and leave, taking her dowry with her. Marriage was both a family alliance and a legal contract. A man could divorce his wife for reasons as broad as jealousy or illness, though he was not permitted to do so if she had no family to return to, if she had properly mourned his parents, or if she had borne him sons. Women, in contrast, had no legal power to initiate a divorce, unless extreme abuse could be proven, and even then, her case would likely depend on her male relatives stepping in on her behalf. The laws regarding adultery reflected a strong gender bias. A woman who was caught cheating could be executed. A man who was caught cheating with a married woman might face punishment, but if he was cheating with a servant or a concubine, it was often overlooked entirely. Honor and legitimacy were tied tightly to a woman's womb. Still, there were exceptions to these rules. Some dynasties saw the rise of powerful imperial women, like Empress Lu Ji and Empress Wu, who wielded immense political power, sometimes bending the legal codes to suit their own ambitions. And in peasant villages, widows who managed households or took over the family business could wield a great deal of informal authority, even if the law did not formally recognize them. In short, ancient Chinese law saw women less as autonomous beings and more as stabilizers of the familial order. They were vital to the functioning of society, yet they were always considered second to the men who supposedly maintained its harmony. As we step back and look across the ancient world, from the ziggurats of Babylon to the palaces of Rome, from Vedic India to Confucian China, one thing becomes abundantly clear: women were always written into the law, but rarely on their own terms. Nearly every ancient legal system assigned women a role within a male-dominated structure. Whether it was in Hammurabi's Code or the Manusmriti, the fundamental legal assumption was that a woman's identity was relational. She was a daughter, a wife, a mother, or a widow. Her rights and responsibilities flowed through the men who were around her. The law defined her, but it rarely empowered her. Some civilizations, like Egypt and Persia, offered women a greater degree of autonomy, allowing them to own property, initiate contracts, and even inherit wealth. In these societies, noble or highborn women could carve out for themselves pockets of legal authority, sometimes even rivaling their male counterparts. But such privileges were far from universal. They depended more on class, family, and circumstance than on any underlying belief in gender equality. Other societies, like Greece and Rome, developed sophisticated legal systems while simultaneously fencing women out of public life. Greek women were legally invisible. Roman women had more agency, but they still lived within a scaffold of male guardianship and social expectations. In China, Confucian values hardened the ideal of the obedient woman into a legal expectation. The law was not just about punishment. It was about preserving a sense of cosmic harmony, and that meant that everyone, especially women, needed to know their place in the social order. Similarly, in Hindu law, a reverence for women coexisted uncomfortably with strict control and moral prescription. Religious laws, such as the Jewish halakha or the Zoroastrian purity codes, often placed women at the intersection of the sacred and the profane. A woman's body could bring honor or impurity, a blessing or a danger, depending on how closely she followed the rules. And yet, within all of these systems, women adapted, resisted, and endured. They found ways to exercise their influence through family, faith, property, or sheer determination. Their stories may not always be carved into stone steely or echoed in the ancient law courts, but they moved beneath the surface, shaping households, dynasties, and entire civilizations. Ultimately, the ancient legal codes tell us not only how these societies treated women, but also how they defined power itself and who they believed deserved to wield it. Long before Wall Street, before bank vaults, banknotes, and savings accounts, the practice of banking began in the mud-brick cities of ancient Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. And surprisingly, the first bankers were not financiers in suits. They were priests. In cities like Uruk, Lagash, and later Babylon, temples were not just religious centers. They were the administrative and economic hearts of urban life. These towering ziggurats and their surrounding complexes served as both spiritual sanctuaries and financial hubs. Farmers and merchants did not just come to the temples to pray. They came to deposit their grain, receive loans, and settle their debts. Why the temples? Because they were the most stable and trusted institutions in the society. The gods would not run off with your money, and the priesthood employed an army of scribes to keep meticulous records of every transaction. When a farmer delivered a portion of his harvest to the temple granary, he would receive a clay tablet with a cuneiform inscription. This tablet would record the quantity of grain stored, the date, the depositor's name, and sometimes the name of a witness. This was not just a receipt, it was an early form of a check. These receipts could then be transferred to another person. A farmer who was in debt could hand over his tablet to a creditor as a form of repayment. A merchant could use them to purchase goods or settle his accounts. In this way, the clay tablet became the ancestor of the promissory note, the deposit slip, and the IOU. Temples also issued loans not just in grain but in silver, sheep, and other commodities. By modern standards, the interest rates were high, typically around 20% for grain and 33% for silver, and they were often compounded annually. These figures were not considered predatory. They were simply the standard rates. High risk meant high reward, and borrowers understood that if their harvest failed or their caravan did not return, they were still responsible for repaying the loan. Both temples and private lenders made fortunes from these loans, and an unpaid debt could lead to the loss of land, property, or even personal freedom. Interestingly, the concept of compound interest was well understood and feared. Some legal codes, like those of Hammurabi, attempted to limit or regulate the practice of charging interest. Others formalized the practice of debt slavery as a form of punishment. This was banking in its rawest, most primal form, both brilliant and brutal. So, while modern banks may be housed in glass towers and rely on spreadsheets, their bones are ancient. The earliest financial systems were not born in markets. They were born in temples. And in Mesopotamia, the gods did not just judge your soul. They also balanced your books. By the time Babylon rose to power under kings like Hammurabi in the 18th century BCE, Mesopotamian banking had become more sophisticated and more personal. While temples and palaces remained important economic players, a new class of financial professionals began to emerge: private moneylenders. These early financiers did not work out of marble lobbies. They conducted their business from humble homes, market stalls, or even in the courtyards of temples. But they had one thing that the temples did not: flexibility. Where temple loans were often seasonal and tied to the agricultural cycles, private moneylenders could tailor their deals to suit the needs of merchants, traders, and craftsmen. Offering loans in silver, Babylon's preferred unit of currency. At this time, silver was not yet minted into coins. That innovation would come much later. Instead, it was weighed out by the shekel, and all loans were documented on clay tablets. These tablets detailed the names of the borrower and the lender, the amount of the loan, the interest rate, the repayment date, and sometimes even the collateral that was offered. If a debtor defaulted on their loan, the lender could legally seize their land, their goods, or even members of their family. Some of these contracts read more like threats than agreements. One fascinating innovation from this period was the rise of joint liability loans, where two or more individuals would share the responsibility for repayment. This helped to reduce the lender's risk and planted the seeds for what we now call co-signed loans. Debt was a pervasive part of Babylonian society. Farmers would borrow to plant their crops. Merchants would borrow to finance their caravan expeditions. And builders would take out loans for large construction projects. Debt slavery was a very real risk, but eventually the law began to push back against it. Hammurabi's famous code offered some relief. For example, if a storm destroyed your crops, you might be exempted from paying interest for that season. Babylon also introduced the use of promissory notes and letters of credit, which were used to transfer money over long distances without having to transport physical silver. These tools allowed wealthy merchants to expand their trade and move money without the risk of being robbed. a protoform of the modern banking network. It is easy to think of banking as a modern system tied to stock tickers and fluctuating interest rates. But in ancient Babylon, the same mechanics, lending, collateral, interest, and risk, were already shaping people's lives and livelihoods. Their tools were made of clay, not computer code, but the game was very much the same. In ancient Egypt, economic life revolved around two constants: the Nile River and the pharaoh's granaries. While Egypt did not develop a formal banking system in the same way as Mesopotamia or later Greece, it nonetheless maintained sophisticated financial practices that were rooted in its temples, royal treasuries, and massive, state-administered storage systems. Instead of coins or silver shekels, the Egyptian economy was built on grain. Wheat and barley were not just food, they were a form of currency. Taxes, wages, and debts were often measured in sacks of grain, and these were stored in vast, centralized granaries. Much like the Babylonian temples, the Egyptian temples functioned as both religious and economic centers. They served as secure storage sites and as financial record offices. Scribes would record every delivery, withdrawal, and transaction on ostraca, which were shards of pottery, or on papyrus scrolls. These records acted as receipts, contracts, and even early forms of checks. If you deposited 10 sacks of grain at the temple granary in Thebes, you might receive a receipt, which you could then trade or present at another location to retrieve an equivalent amount of grain, a precursor to the modern bank draft. Loans were a common practice. A farmer might borrow seed grain to plant in the spring, with the promise of repaying the loan after the harvest, usually with interest. The rates varied, but a 25 to 30% interest rate on a grain loan was not unusual. These loans were enforced by scribes and local officials, and a default could result in the forfeiture of land, livestock, or even labor. Unlike in Babylon, however, private lending in Egypt was more restricted. The state played a dominant role in organizing the economic exchange. High officials, priests, and royal administrators were the main actors in any large-scale financial activity. Yet, there are surviving records of private individuals, including women, who acted as lenders and creditors in their local communities. These cases were less common, but they demonstrate a level of grassroots financial agency that is not often acknowledged. Coinage was only introduced into Egypt during the late period, influenced by foreign powers like the Persians and later the Greeks. But even then, the Egyptians preferred to use grain and barter systems over metal money. Proof that a functioning economy does not necessarily need coins, just trust, storage, and good records. So, while Egypt may have lacked the sleek columns of a Roman bank or the aggressive contracts of Babylon, it ran a tight, temple-based economy that was built on grain, writing, and bureaucracy. And in doing so, it laid the groundwork for a financial infrastructure that would last for thousands of years. With the rise of city-states like Athens and Corinth in the 5th century BCE, ancient Greece introduced two financial revolutions: the minted coin and the money changer. Unlike in Mesopotamia or Egypt, where grain and silver were the dominant currencies, the Greeks embraced metal coinage as a public standard. These coins were stamped, regulated, and guaranteed by the state. This shift created a new class of financial professionals, the trapetitai, who were named after the trapeza, or table, from which they worked in the bustling agora. These men functioned as money changers, deposit takers, lenders, and financial agents. They would exchange foreign coins, hold money for their clients for safekeeping, offer loans, and even keep accounts for them, a rudimentary form of a checking account. If you needed to send money to another city-state, it was no problem. The trapetitai could issue a written draft, which allowed merchants to avoid traveling with heavy, theft-prone coinage. If that sounds like a bank transfer, that is because it was, albeit with more sand and fewer algorithms. Lending was a huge part of Greek banking. Interest rates were generally high, especially for risky ventures like maritime trade. Some loans carried an interest rate of 100%, which was justified by the danger of shipwreck, piracy, or storms. These loans were backed by maritime contracts, which included details of the cargo, the route, the repayment terms, and the collateral. If the ship sank, the loan was voided. But if it returned with big profits, both the merchant and the lender could make a killing. Private citizens could also act as lenders. Wealthy Athenians often invested in smaller loans that were secured by property or enslaved people. These transactions were documented before witnesses and scribes and could be enforced in a court of law. In fact, the Greek courts were flooded with debt cases, which is an early sign that money, trust, and lawsuits are eternal bedfellows. And yet, the banks in Greece were not formal institutions like we would expect to see today. They were more like financial freelancers with very serious reputations. There were no licenses, no regulations, and no government insurance. If your trapezites skipped town with your deposit, it was just too bad. Trust was everything, and it could be shattered in a heartbeat. Despite these risks, the Greek financial world thrived. It enabled trade, supported the building of an empire, and even bankrolled wars. In a city where logic and debate ruled, so too did contracts, ledgers, and interest rates. Ancient Greece taught us that once you stamp a coin and assign it a value, the rest follows. From debt and profit to risk and ruin. By the time Rome ruled the Mediterranean, banking had evolved from small-scale loans to a full-blown financial engine that powered an entire empire. The Romans, who were ever the pragmatists, did not invent banking, but they perfected it, expanded it, and embedded it deep into the fabric of everyday life. At the heart of Roman finance were the argentarii, the Roman equivalent of bankers. These men operated out of tabernae, or shops, near the forum and acted as money changers, deposit takers, lenders, and financial agents. They would exchange coins from all across the empire, hold private deposits for safekeeping, pay out loans, and even execute payments between third parties. Wealthy Romans, including senators, would deposit large sums of money with these bankers, who kept ledgers called rations, the ancestors of our modern account books. A client could authorize their banker to pay another person using the money from their deposit, which created an early version of the check. If you wanted to send money to Carthage or Alexandria, there was no need to pack a bag of coins. Your banker could simply issue a letter of credit. The real fuel behind Roman banking, however, was credit. Loans were not just for emergencies. They were used for trade, land purchases, construction projects, and even election campaigns. Lending at interest, which was usually around 12%, though it could be higher or lower depending on the risk, was legal, but it was subject to regulation. The charging of excessively high interest was generally frowned upon, but it was often ignored. Collateral was key to these arrangements. Land, enslaved people, or future earnings could all be used to secure a loan. And Rome had a robust system of legal enforcement. If you did not pay your debts, you could be dragged to court, have your property seized, or in extreme cases, be enslaved. Unlike in earlier societies, Rome allowed for corporations of financiers, known as societates publicanorum or publicani, to handle large-scale government contracts, including tax collection. These were profit-seeking enterprises with investors, managers, and shareholders, which makes them eerily similar to modern banks and hedge funds. Yet there were risks involved. Roman bankers were not backed by the state, and financial crises did happen. Records show that some banking houses collapsed, which would trigger waves of panic. Does that sound familiar? In the Roman world, money flowed through temples, forums, and estates, binding together farmers, traders, soldiers, and senators. And as the empire grew fat on its conquests, its financial systems stretched out like invisible roads, connecting people not with stone, but with credit, debt, and interest. Before the concept of a central bank ever existed, the idea of state control over currency was already revolutionizing how economies functioned. In ancient times, the power to mint coins was not just an economic power, it was a political one. Whoever issued the coins held the trust of the people, and that trust became the backbone of the early banking systems. The earliest coins appeared in Lydia, which is in modern-day Turkey, around 600 BCE. These coins were made of electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver, and these stamped pieces of metal marked a shift from weighed metal to a standardized form of currency. There was no more need to measure chunks of silver in a dusty market. Now, the value of a coin could be verified at a single glance. Other civilizations quickly adopted this idea. The Greeks minted drachmas, the Persians issued darics, and the Romans built an entire empire on their denarii. These coins bore the symbols of the state, images of gods or rulers, and various inscriptions, not just to represent their value, but also to signal legitimacy and control. A coin was as much a piece of propaganda as it was a financial tool. With the advent of state-backed coinage, new financial behaviors began to emerge. Hoards of coins were stored in temples, households, and merchant treasuries. Lending became easier and more portable. Coins could circulate quickly between city-states, and with uniform weights and metal content, traders could move their goods across borders with a newfound sense of confidence. In turn, the early bankers, from the Mesopotamian lenders to the Roman argentarii, adapted to this new certainty. They no longer needed to test the weights or purity of the metals as frequently. Instead, they began to track the coins by their type, the year they were minted, and their issuer. This consistency reduced the friction in transactions, expanded trade routes, and made the process of lending more predictable. Coinage also played a role in inflation and monetary policy, albeit in a crude form. Rulers could debase their coins by mixing cheaper metals into the alloy, which would stretch the treasury's resources but also undermine the public's trust in the currency. The Roman emperors famously did this to pay their armies, which triggered cycles of devaluation and economic instability. Still, the idea stuck: a currency that was backed by a state, stamped with its symbol and guaranteed in its value. This concept laid the groundwork for everything from the gold coins of the medieval period to modern fiat money. In a way, each ancient coin was more than just a piece of metal. It was a promise, a contract, and a tool of empire. It told you not only how much something was worth, but also who had the power to decide that worth. In the ancient world, the line between faith and finance was often thin, if it existed at all. Temples did not just serve the gods. They also served as the earliest safe deposit boxes, banks, and loan offices. Why was this the case? Because people trusted the gods far more than they trusted kings, merchants, or wandering moneylenders. Take Delphi, for instance. The sanctuary of Apollo was not just a religious destination. It was a financial powerhouse. City-states would store their war funds there. Wealthy individuals would deposit their fortunes, and treasuries were built within the temple precincts. Religious centers like Delos, Ephesus, and Jerusalem also acted as de facto banks, offering security, prestige, and scribes who kept careful records of every transaction. A vault that was under divine watch was seen as being safer than any home or fortress. These temples played several financial roles. They held deposits, issued loans, and in some cases even collected interest. In Mesopotamia, as early as the 3rd millennium BCE, temple priests oversaw lending systems where borrowers would repay their loans with grain or silver. In Egypt, the temple granaries stored wealth, issued receipts, and facilitated trade. In Greece and Rome, temples frequently held public funds, safeguarded the spoils of war, and underwrote the costs of construction and festivals, all under the sacred seal of a deity. And apparently, the gods were patient creditors. The temples were not just passive vaults. They actively lent out money. In Athens, for example, the Temple of Athena on the Acropolis would loan silver to the state at interest to fund major public works projects. Religion also provided the ethical framework for finance. Ancient Hebrew law, for instance, prohibited the charging of interest to fellow Israelites but allowed it for foreigners, a moral boundary that blended spiritual identity with economic policy. The Hindu Dharma texts laid out rules for fair lending, debt repayment, and even the spiritual consequences of financial misconduct. Of course, these systems were not without their flaws. Temples could be looted in times of war, and clerics could be corrupt. But for most of the ancient world, the temples were the most trusted institutions, enduring, stable, and reinforced by a sense of divine fear. So, when you picture ancient banking, do not just imagine dusty coins and cloaked lenders. Picture golden statues, the scent of incense, and marble columns. Because for thousands of years, the safest place to put your money was not under a mattress. It was beneath the watchful eyes of the gods. Long before the invention of credit cards or mortgage calculators, ancient economies ran on a system that was surprisingly familiar. Borrow now, pay later with interest. Whether you were a Mesopotamian farmer, a Greek merchant, or a Roman senator, if you needed capital, you went to a lender. But the ancient rules of lending were often much harsher, and the consequences of defaulting on a loan were far more personal. Interest was not just allowed, it was expected. In Babylon, the rates were steep, 20% for grain and 33% for silver, and it was often compounded annually. These figures were not considered predatory. They were simply the standard. High risk meant high reward, and borrowers understood that if their harvest failed or their caravan did not return, they were still on the hook for the loan. Both temples and private lenders made fortunes from these loans, and an unpaid debt could lead to debt slavery or the seizure of property. In ancient Greece, especially in Athens, the interest rates varied depending on the risk involved. The riskiest loans were the maritime loans. A lender might front the silver to fund a trading voyage, knowing that the ship might sink or be seized by pirates. To offset this risk, the interest rates could soar to 100% or even more. But if the ship returned safely, both the merchant and the lender could make a significant profit. The Romans added legal muscle to these arrangements. Loan contracts were written down, witnessed, and sealed. The collateral, which could be land or enslaved people, was recorded in detail. If you missed a payment, your creditor could take you to court, seize your property, or in extreme cases, force you into bonded labor. Roman law set a 12% cap on interest rates, but loopholes and exemptions made that number flexible, especially during times of economic stress. Despite the risks, borrowing was a common practice. Farmers would borrow seeds, merchants would borrow to buy goods, and politicians would borrow to fund their campaigns. Lending greased the gears of the ancient economies, and defaulting on a loan was an accepted hazard of the system. And yes, fraud and manipulation were also part of the game. Lenders would sometimes demand bribes or add on administrative fees. Borrowers could lie about their collateral or simply disappear. Without credit scores or banking regulations, trust and reputation were everything. In the end, ancient loans were not just financial tools. They were power plays. To borrow money was to risk more than just the money itself. It was to stake your land, your freedom, and sometimes even your family on the chance that tomorrow would be a better, or at least a more profitable day. From the grain receipts of Mesopotamia to the silver ledgers of Rome, ancient banking was not just a footnote in economic history. It was the foundation upon which our modern systems are built. These early systems of deposits, loans, interest, and financial record-keeping did not just fuel local trade. They quietly shaped the architecture of global finance. At the heart of every ancient banking system was the same challenge that we face today: trust. Could people trust that the weight of the silver was fair, that the grain in the temple granary would not spoil or vanish, or that the lender would not disappear with their deposit? And out of that trust, or the desperate need for it, arose the practices of record-keeping, contracts, and ultimately institutional finance. The innovations of this period were astonishing for their time. The ancient Babylonians developed loan contracts with fixed interest rates, repayment terms, and legal witnesses, all inscribed in cuneiform on clay tablets. The ancient Greeks pioneered the use of letters of credit, which allowed funds to be transferred between city-states without the need to carry heavy coins. The Romans created bankers' associations and formalized the process of debt enforcement in their civil law, building a financial system that could stretch from Britain to Syria. Even today, echoes of ancient banking remain. The modern check evolved from the Mesopotamian clay receipts. The concept of collateralized loans is rooted in the practices of the Babylonians and the Romans. And central banking and monetary policy can trace their ancestry back to the rulers who would manipulate the purity of their coins or the wealth of their temples to fund armies and public projects. And what about regulation? Well, it turns out that ancient societies understood the concept of a financial crisis all too well. In Babylon, kings would periodically declare a forgiveness of debts to prevent the collapse of their society. Roman emperors would sometimes impose caps on interest rates to curb the practice of predatory lending. These were not just economic decisions. They were political acts that were aimed at keeping society balanced and stable. But perhaps the greatest legacy of ancient banking is the realization that finance is not a new concept. The tools have changed, clay tablets have become spreadsheets, and silver shekels have become digital currencies. But the fundamental human behaviors remain the same: risk, ambition, trust, fear, and the hope of personal gain. The next time you log into your bank app or swipe a credit card, remember that you are not doing anything new. You are participating in a system that began with scribes and temples, coins stamped by kings, and farmers betting their entire harvest on the hope of a better season. And it all began with a simple idea. Sometimes, to build the future, you have to borrow from it. The ink had barely dried on the US Constitution when the young republic found itself facing its first major crisis. This crisis did not come from foreign invaders or political disputes, but from something far more potent: whiskey. In the early 1790s, America was financially broken. The Revolutionary War had left the nation buried under a mountain of debt, and the new federal government, under the leadership of President George Washington and Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, desperately needed a solution. Hamilton, always the fiscal strategist, proposed an excise tax on distilled spirits produced within the country, with whiskey being the most common. To the urban elites and coastal merchants, this seemed like a reasonable measure. But on the western frontier, it felt like a direct assault from a distant, powdered Whig aristocracy. In the western regions, such as western Pennsylvania, whiskey was not just a beverage, it was a form of currency. Farmers would distill their surplus grain into whiskey because it was easier to transport, less likely to spoil, and far more profitable than selling the raw crops. Bartering with whiskey for goods and services was a common part of daily life. So, when the federal government began to tax it, many people on the frontier saw it not as a way to generate revenue, but as a betrayal. It was a reminder that power was once again concentrating in a distant authority, the very kind they had just fought a revolution to escape from. To make matters worse, the structure of the tax itself seemed specifically designed to disadvantage small-scale producers. Large distilleries had the option to pay a flat annual fee, but smaller distillers, like those in the Appalachian Hills, were required to pay by the gallon. This meant that, proportionally, the small-time farmer paid more. As federal tax collectors began to arrive on horseback to enforce this new law, tensions started to boil over. At first, the resistance was minor. Inspectors were threatened, tax documents were burned, and revenue officers were politely advised to get lost. But soon, polite turned to violent. The practice of tarring and feathering made a comeback. Taxmen were chased from their homes. In one instance, a revenue officer was stripped naked, tied to a tree, and had his hair cut off. A form of frontier justice fueled by moonshine and rage. And all the while, Washington was watching, waiting silently, but not for long. What had begun as a simple tax protest was on the verge of spiraling into an armed uprising, one that would test the strength of the Constitution and Washington's resolve to uphold it. By 1792, the whiskey tax was not just unpopular, it was radioactive. In the backwoods communities of Pennsylvania, Kentucky, and Virginia, the opposition was transforming from scattered grumblings into a coordinated act of defiance. Tax collectors were becoming all too familiar with the sounds of breaking windows and the sharp crack of gunfire overhead. The western counties of Pennsylvania became the epicenter of what many were now calling an outright rebellion. Meetings were held in taverns and cabins, where kegs of homemade whiskey stood proudly beside muskets. These were not just drunken complaints, they were organized gatherings. Locals formed their own militias, issued threats against federal officials, and even passed their own resolutions condemning the tax. Some refused to do business with anyone who complied with it. It was a movement that was part protest, part mafia, with a side of corn liquor. In 1793, the situation escalated even further. Tax collectors and their sympathizers were ambushed, whipped, and publicly humiliated. One man was captured and paraded through town with a sign that read, "Coward," hung around his neck. It was like the Boston Tea Party, but with more alcohol and worse hygiene. The federal courts responded by issuing summonses to bring the rebels to justice. But serving legal papers in a place where the local sheriff might be a part of the mob was a difficult task. The region was effectively descending into lawlessness, as local officials either turned a blind eye or quietly sided with the insurgents. President Washington, normally a calm and measured man, was beginning to grit his false teeth. The Whiskey Rebellion was threatening not only public order but also the very legitimacy of federal law. If the government could not enforce its own taxes, then what was the purpose of having a constitution? What was the purpose of government itself? Still, Washington did not act hastily. He sent federal commissioners to negotiate with the rebels. But it was like trying to serve tea during a bar fight. The rebels had already formed committees, held conventions, and in some cases were even discussing full-on secession. They saw themselves not as criminals, but as patriots standing up against tyranny. Meanwhile, Hamilton, ever the hawk, was whispering in Washington's ear, "Are you really going to let these guys stomp on the Constitution after everything we just went through?" And so Washington made a decision, one that would shock the rebels and set a historic precedent. He would raise a federal army to march against his own people. By 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion had become more than just a backwoods tantrum. It was an open challenge to federal authority. George Washington, who had led a revolution just a decade earlier, now found himself in the strange position of leading an army against his fellow Americans, the very citizens he had helped to liberate. And this was no small militia. Washington called for more than 12,000 troops, a force nearly 3 times the size of the one he had commanded